The Psychedelic Report.
Psychedelic drugs
have played their part in America's long, strange trip toward an understanding of mind-altering drugs.
The Psychedelic News.
Leading physicians, scientists, and experts share their wisdom about psychedelic medicines and healing.
50 years ago, psychedelic drugs were at the center of America's counterculture.
The brightest minds in psychedelic medicine. The Psychedelic Report.
We use the ketamine-assisted psychotherapy model that happens to have psychedelic effects that were not predicted when the drug was first developed.
From researchers to investors.
I think the biggest mistake we've made as a culture is the war on drugs.
To physicians to shamans and nonprofit pioneers.
Psychedelic drugs.
Recent research suggests some of them could have legitimate uses.
The Psychedelic News
brings you diverse perspectives from the front lines of this exciting movement. The Psychedelic Report.
The Psychedelic Report was brought to you by Apollo Neuroscience and produced by Future Medicine Media. Welcome to the Psychedelic Report, your single source of truth for the psychedelic news. I'm your host, Dr. Dave Rabin. I'm a neuroscientist and psychiatrist trained in ketamine-assisted psychotherapy as well as MDMA-assisted therapy. Today, in this very special episode of the Psychedelic Report, we are honoring International Overdose Awareness Day. This year, this fell on August 31st. The World Health Organization estimates that there are an annual 500,000 worldwide deaths attributable to drug use, and 70% are attributed to opioids. An estimated 2 million Americans, that's 0.7%, aged 12 years and older, meet criteria for opioid use disorder. We are currently in a historic shift when we think about who is to blame for the opioid crisis. For those who aren't familiar, Purdue Pharma filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in 2019, and it is now widely accepted that they intentionally deceived physicians and care providers and the medical community at large by advertising OxyContin, known as oxycodone hydrochloride, as less prone to abuse than existing alternatives to increase profits. In the 1960s, over 80% of people entering treatment for heroin addiction started their habit on heroin. Now, about 80% of people who use heroin misused prescription opioids first. This is a huge problem for us as a society, and it touches every single one of us. I personally do not know a single person who has not known somebody in their lives who has struggled with chronic pain or opioid and narcotic use. To date, it is estimated that the cost of managing the challenge of opioid overdoses alone is over $1 trillion. This is a tremendous burden and an avoidable burden that our society carries with us every year. As such, the Board of Medicine, a nonprofit 501c3 organization and medical board, of which I am the executive director, has worked diligently over the last 5 years to create consensus guidance for physicians and care providers and patients for how to use cannabis and cannabinoid molecules to reduce harm and risk in people who are struggling with chronic pain and opioid use disorder. From decades of research, of watching what has happened to our societies with the legalization state by state of cannabis and cannabinoid-based substances, we have seen a dramatic reduction in the use, abuse, and overdoses associated with opioid molecules and opioid medications used to treat chronic pain. In communities that use cannabis, which is highlighted in an article that was just published by the Board of Medicine as a consensus piece in August 16th of this year, entitled An Answered Call for Aid, Cannabinoid Clinical Framework for the Opioid Epidemic, published in Harm Reduction Journal, we highlight the evidence to support that cannabis and cannabinoid molecules are a much, much safer alternative to opioids for chronic pain management. The CDC, over the last 3 years, has announced a call for non-opioid-based therapies to treat chronic pain. We have not had a diligent effort as a medical community to focus on non-opioid pain medications for a long time. This is one of the first and most important missions for us as a medical community coming into the 21st century. We now understand from decades of opioid misuse and abuse that this has an incredibly devastating toll on our society and on our families and communities. Opiates, while being very effective at treating acute pain in the short term, have devastating adverse effects and complications in the long term, including impaired judgment, impaired insight, and ultimately death due to overdose.
As such, the Board of Medicine has taken upon itself to provide alternatives to opioid use such as cannabis. Anybody who's interested in this work can view the recently published article, An Answered Call for Aid, Cannabinoid Clinical Framework for the Opioid Epidemic, in the August issue of Harm Reduction Journal. In this particular issue, which we highly recommend that all clinicians listening to this show check out, we provide some of the first evidence-based guidelines for how to treat chronic pain and opioid use disorder in a very simple chart entitled Table 1 that gives step-by-step instructions for how to treat chronic pain using cannabinoids and cannabis products, as well as how to treat opioid use disorder and to prevent those from being prescribed opiates long-term. For anybody who's interested in reviewing this information and contacting us, please feel free to reach out. We now have a list of products as one of the first medical boards to endorse safe and vetted cannabinoid products. You can find any of these products at theboardofmedicine.org Clinical Cannabis Initiative. In addition to cannabis, what is highlighted by this work is that plant medicines in general may have lots of potential to treat lots of different chronic conditions that we have not had success treating in traditional Western methods. Focusing on opioid use disorder for this particular episode, we move to discussion of a very old plant, a plant that came out of African cultures that has been grown and used for thousands of years. This plant is known as Iboga. The Iboga plant, used by the Bwiti people, has been used for coming-of-age ceremonies as well as for healing in this culture for many generations, with the techniques passed down through oral tradition. Today, we'll take a deep dive into the history of Iboga, how and why it is effective, and how it may be one of the most promising treatments on the horizon for opioid use disorder and people struggling with opioid addiction. We have seen from early trials that as little as 48 hours of treatment with Iboga, that patients who are actively addicted and withdrawing from short-acting opioid molecules are actually entering remission within just 48 hours. This is fascinating for us as a medical field because we have never seen medicine have an effect with single doses in this manner, especially to treat disorders like opioid use disorder, which is notoriously extremely challenging to treat and has very few treatments that actually are successful. While we will talk more in future episodes about the effects of cannabis use long-term to treat chronic pain, today we will focus on the understanding of Iboga to treat acute opioid use disorder, helping people detox off of opioids and helping save lives. This is an extremely exciting area of research in addiction, medicine, and psychiatry.
You're listening to the Psychedelic Report.
We are so excited to bring you our special guest, Dr. Joseph Barsuglia. Dr. Joseph Barsuglia is a clinical psychologist and a MAPS-trained MDMA-assisted psychotherapist, and one of the leading experts on ibogaine, Iboga, and 5-MeO, and has been working with Dr. Polanco on some extremely interesting treatments for veterans with severe PTSD and substance use disorder. And we are so excited to have him here today to teach us about these extremely powerful and ancient medicines. Dr. Joseph?
Yeah, really excited to be here with you, dear friends and fellow colleagues in this exciting space and talking about two of my loves, two compounds that kind of brought me into this space and initiated me into the psychedelic world. And yeah, just been really deeply involved with these in different levels for about the past 6 years. So they both have their own kind of respective histories and science around them and reasons for why they might be used. Iboga, just to begin with that, it's a master plant medicine with a lot of history of indigenous use in Africa, and specifically in Central Africa and Gabon and Congo. And this plant medicine has been used for likely millennia by what we would call the pygmy people, which is a bit pejorative of a term to use, but the pygmy people are the forest dwellers, have a number of different kind of tribal names to describe their groups, but they've been using this plant in ceremony, kind of like ayahuasca in a sense. Master healer for them, it's a plant that's used primarily for initiation, from bringing oftentimes men into adulthood, and also women. They use it in indigenous culture as a tool to bring about physical healing, emotional healing, and there's a really kind of robust and established science and tradition that they have used with this medicine. And it wasn't quote unquote discovered by the West until like French explorers kind of came in the 1900s and started going through the jungle and going deeper and deeper and discovered these tribes that were using Iboga. And there's such a rich history and tradition with this medicine that I think is not really known and is not spoken about, in my experience, in the current psychedelic space with the companies that are moving Ibogaine forward as a therapy. So I think in looking at this medicine, it's really important to have kind of a deep, grounded understanding of how it's been used in indigenous cultures and how it's used even spiritually and ceremonially, how they use it. There's a really beautiful kind of preparation rites and protocols that are used in the jungle. And my partner and I, we've been to Africa and been initiated, and it's been really profound in terms of how it's used. And so a lot of Westerners have gone over to Africa in the last recent decades and been initiated. And it kind of came on the scene in the US in the 60s when a heroin addict by the name of Howard Lotsoff was kind of randomly given this psychedelic by a friend who was like kind of exploring it for psychonaut purposes or just to have a trip. And he was dependent on heroin at the time and went through this long 48-hour journey and came out on the other side not craving opiates, not wanting to use heroin anymore. And from that point, there's kind of a whole history of how Ibogaine spread through kind of underground addiction circles for healing. You have in the recent decades clinics popping up using Ibogaine, which we can kind of clarify. Ibogaine is the prominent extract of the Iboga plant, kind of like THC is from cannabis. Ibogaine is one of many alkaloids that are present in the Iboga plant. And there's these clinics that started treating people with addiction. And this was very much a kind of grassroots movement with no real government approval or oversight, but with profound efficacy in treating multiple forms of substance addiction. So what you have now is sort of an international scene of clinics that are operating, some with less oversight, some with more oversight, in which people are traveling from all over the world that have different forms of substance abuse and chemical addictions and a number of other issues that are able to access this, usually in medical clinics or with supervision for various forms of healing. And there is sort of a history of it being advanced in the US. There was some early funding that happened with the National Institute of Drug Abuse that were funding preclinical research, which kind of interestingly died out and lost funding in the 90s, kind of went extinct and is now being revamped by a lot of the investment coming into the psychedelic sector. And you have some governments that have looked at this, like there's pilot programs in New Zealand that are using Ibogaine for treating addiction. We can talk later, but there's a lot of groups in the psychedelic space that are kind of moving this forward for addiction treatments. And what Dr. Martin and I were involved with, I got involved with this about 6 years ago, coming out of my postdoc, introduced through a friend to Martin. And he had this clinic in Mexico where they had been using Ibogaine. I'd never heard of Ibogaine. But when I understood what it did, I was blown away that I hadn't heard about it because I worked as a psychologist in addiction clinics. And a friend of mine told me, look, there's this doctor running a clinic and they're essentially reversing opiate addiction in like 48 hours with a plant medicine. And my jaw kind of hit the ground of how this could be possible. And then Martin brought me into the clinic to kind of start capturing data and evidence of what's going on, what people are experiencing in their psychedelic experience of this medicine, how it's working for them. So we were using that medicine and also 5-MeO-DMT, which is a form of DMT that has been more popularly known as the toad medicine, or coming from the venom of the Sonoran desert toad. At the clinic, one of the counselors at the time had a connection to this medicine, and some of the indigenous groups that were using this form of DMT in Mexico started integrating this therapy sort of on the back end of an Ibogaine treatment protocol. So like people were coming in predominantly addicted to opiates or multiple substances, like substance addiction goes. People are using alcohol or meth or different substances coming in seeking healing. They would do an Ibogaine treatment and then recover from that. And then at the end of the week, do a one-on-one session with 5-MeO-DMT. And the medicines in some way couldn't be more different than one another, but equally profound in terms of the depth of healing that can happen, also the intensity of the psychedelic experiences. And we were seeing incredible results. And myself, and I really had fun as a research director with Martin. We had a really nice group of graduate research assistants, and I pulled in a lot of friends and colleagues, and we started just collecting data and publishing papers on these different medicines, and published about half a dozen papers that are now in the NIH PubMed database on the observational study of these medicines. So the studies on Ibogaine really that we did show, like some of the other initial studies, that you bring someone in that's addicted to opiates, they take a moderate to strong dosage of Ibogaine, and they go through a really profound psychedelic experience that lasts much longer than any other psychedelic in terms of its duration, and come out on the other side about 48 hours later with minimal cravings, withdrawal symptoms. It gets people through a lot of the withdrawal process that would happen if you were just a cold turkey stop taking opiates. And it has this kind of capacity to reset the opiate receptors to this kind of pre-addicted state. So people come out not craving, not in withdrawal, and actually feeling really good with their mood and how they feel connected to their body. We looked at the long-term observational effects of these medicines, like how did people do a month out, 3 months, 6, 12 months out after their experience with their substance use? What were their positive psychological gains that they had made coming through this experience? And then also we published some research on what are the subjective effects of 5-MeO-DMT. So like when you smoke 5-MeO-DMT, what happens and what is kind of the experiential effect of that? And I compared this medicine on a scale that's been used in psilocybin research, which is a classic questionnaire used in psychedelic research called the Mystical Experience Questionnaire, which looks at the different facets of a religious or mystical spiritual experience, like these peak spiritual experiences. And how did that compare to psilocybin? What we found, maybe you've used this substance or you know people that have used it. It has a colloquial term of being called a God molecule because people have these really profound transcendental, spiritual, unitive experiences on this medicine that can really take you outside of time and space and take you into an experience of bliss and love, but also can be profoundly challenging and a lot of fear can come up. So we captured that and presented some data at the 2017 Psychedelic Science Conference by MAPS. And been involved in continuing to look at the observational research on that medicine. And there's a lot that can be said about both these medicines in terms of addiction and healing, and also from a therapeutic and spiritual context. So,
wow. I mean, such incredible work, and it's helped so many people. You know, I'm wondering, we touched on a lot of different things there. And do you want to dive a little deeper into either wherever you want to go first? The history of Iboga and how that's been traditionally used in the Bwiti culture, which I've personally been reading a lot about recently in Terence McKenna's Food of the Gods, which is an incredible book if any of you have not checked it out. Or we can jump into 5-MeO's history. Where do you want to go first?
I think we could start at the root with Iboga.
Let's do it. I love it. I love it.
Yeah, so Iboga it's a plant medicine. It's actually like a bush in Africa that grows, from 10 to 30 feet tall or so, and has these little kind of yellow peppery fruits on it. And the medicine, the whole plant's medicinal, and they use the leaves in Gabon, but the concentration of the alkaloids that are active are in the middle layer of the root bark. So if you were to go into the root system, kind of shave off the outer layer and then get to the middle layer between the core root. And the older the tree, the better the medicine. And the more bitter the root is, the more medicinal it is, which is kind of a principle that's in maybe herbology or Chinese medicine, that bitter medicines tend to be more medicinal. So this plant in Gabon, it grows in kind of the equatorial region, so along the equator, which requires a lot of rainfall, and the best plants, the most medicinal plants, are found deep in the forest amongst these areas that have lots of vegetation, excessive amounts of rain. And the best Iboga is also, from my experience or from my teachers that I've studied with in Gabon, it's like you want the alchemy and the synergy of the other plants that are around the Iboga. Because if you were to kind of make an Iboga farm, plant these trees kind of in a monoculture or something like monocrop, they don't have all of the interplay with the other plants that are found deep in the forest. So there's a lot of people that are trying to grow Iboga or popping up online, or people trying to buy these plants. And the best plants are the ones that are really where the pygmies are, where the forest dwellers are, that are deep in the forest. And they are older plants as well. So the Iboga plant takes about 7-8 years to grow any medicine. So it's not until that point that the root system starts to have active alkaloids. And then it's kind of like a like a fine wine, or perhaps is a kind of bad analogy, but the older the plant, the more rich the alkaloid content is. So I've tried plants that are 10 years old, 20 years old, 30, 40 years old, and the older plants tend to be more medicinal, and also from a psychedelic experience tend to be more like smooth and kind of rich in terms of their intelligence.
I know in Napa and Europe, they have a lot of focus on older vines for certain varietals that really make a difference in the flavor and the complexity that comes out.
Yeah, I recently learned, San Pedro is kind of similar, the cactus with mescaline. And it seems to be the case that, there's more complexity of the alkaloid content with the older plants. And it's kind of like peyote too. Peyote is like something that can take decades to really grow and have really alkaloid content in the plant. So from that perspective, also from a conservation perspective, it's really, I think, important where you can't just go ripping these things out of the jungle and trying to cash in on them or grow scalable businesses with this rare, precious kind of ancient plant that takes decades to grow. And there's a massive issue in Gabon, and I think in kind of an ethical issue in the psychedelic space of, okay, if we're going to move this medicine forward, we have to have substantial give back and replant and reforest. There's only one organization I know that's doing anything about this, which is called Blessings of the Forest in Gabon. And they're planting and replanting Iboga in Gabon and want to grow it more internationally. But there's not even enough Iboga in Gabon for the Gabonese people and for Bwiti ceremonies. So it's really endangered. Jan, who's the founder of that nonprofit Iboga conservation group, he says we need to be planting basically millions of Iboga trees all over the world, given the benefits that it has for humanity. So going back to the Bwiti in Gabon, so these are arising from like an animist culture, forest dwelling people in Gabon, and they have such really beautiful kind of spiritual context for this medicine. And some of our teachers from Gabon, they suggest that the Pygmies, there was an association with the Pygmies in ancient Egypt, and some of the harp players that were in the Egyptian courts and some of the temples that they were working with, Iboga. And my partner Trish and I, we had a beautiful opportunity to go to Egypt this last year, right before COVID. And there's a temple there called Abydos, and these different temples had like different initiatory rites, ceremonial practices. And our teacher says that Iboga was used in Abydos as part of kind of the Egyptian training in like divination and spirituality, spiritual ritual, that it was something that may have been used. And it's really hard to know because Bwiti is kind of like, it's like a mystery school. It's called like an initiatory cult. So a central principle in Bwiti is that if you're Bwiti, you don't write books about Bwiti. It's like forbidden actually to write books about the tradition. So you don't see like Bwiti shaman writing books about Bwiti or anything like this. And it's very much an oral tradition. So we don't really know, but I trust some of the oral tradition that's been shared with me, and that is likely the case. In Bwiti, they refer to Iboga as the tree of knowledge. That's kind of analogous to the Christian or Jewish story in the Garden of Eden of these trees that were in paradise that bridge us to the divine. They view it that way, although in the Bwiti culture, you have this really strong colonizing influence of the French that came in. And the French came in, and you have missionaries that came in, and they even use like animal sacrifice, and it's an ancestral worshiping practice. And so you see this kind of weird Christian influence, hybrid kind of syncretic sort of influence in a lot of Bwiti tribes. You see like in one of the tradition I went to, they have crosses and Jesus statues and Mary paintings, and you see this interwoven in some of the more mystical Bwiti traditions. And within the Bwiti culture, there's many different types of lineages and tribes and ways of practice. If it's Bwiti, they do share Iboga. They share that as a common kind of their sacrament, and they all share some understanding of initiation. And in that practice, for example, we're to go to Gabon and get initiated, it's usually like a 2-week process. And before you ingest the medicine, there's a whole kind of series of ritual preparation, cleansing. You're doing these baths. It's much different than Amazonian shamanism, but similar in the sense of like the ritual purification. So you're taking multiple baths per day. You are sometimes taking purgatives to clean the body. There's use of fire typically. And the whole point is to really meet your soul, to connect with your soul, to connect with your ancestors. The word Bwiti means dead or the ancestors. And so it's a central tenet of it. So there's sort of a pop culture reference that you can see in the movie Black Panther, where the protagonist, he eats this plant and then goes on this journey to meet his relatives who give him guidance and direction. That's in a way what they do in Bwiti.
You're listening to the Psychedelic Report.
If we think about addiction as a symptom of disconnection, spiritual disconnection, disconnection with ourself, disconnection with the tribe, with a loving kind of interconnected tribe. Iboga is amazing, and the cultural context for that is really beautiful because, for example, if you go to Gabon and get initiated, it's not like something that you go and do and then you get a notch on your psychedelic belt or your psychonaut list. It's like, from their perspective, you're being initiated into a family. It's like kind of ridiculous from a Gabonese perspective for a Westerner to come get initiated and not come back and be part of that village. Of course, it's a tribal culture, so there's like a rich understanding of interconnectedness. And a central part of a Bwiti initiation is, in some of the lineages like Dasumba, they give you kind of obscene amounts of Iboga where you're in the deepest journey that you can go into. And the whole focus of the journey is to find your name. And what they mean by your name is like your spiritual identity or who you are at your soul essence. And when you come back from that journey and the medicine tells you who you are, your ancestors tell you who you are, the spirit of the medicine shows you your identity, you come back and your identity is your role or your gift to the tribe.
Makes so much sense. That is so similar to, I feel like, what we do, at least what I do with my patients in ketamine-assisted psychotherapy.
Yeah, indeed. So it's like, if you can imagine, as an initiation, we get stuck, I think, in the West because we, of course, lack mirroring. Like, central concept in psychotherapy is like mirroring. Like, were you shown who you were? Do you know who you are? Were you empathically, emotionally mirrored? And a lot of times we weren't because we grew up in a box with two nuclear parents. Whereas if you're in a tribe, you have 100 moms and dads, and you have a sense of your mirroring and context and interconnectedness with all these different beings, and you understand yourself in connection to a larger community. We do have our own respective tribes, but I think in a much different way. So part of initiation is also, leaving the past behind, leaving the childhood ways behind, leaving the developmental cords, for better, for worse, that you're attached to with your parents, and stepping into your true identity of who you are. I have people as a psychologist coming to me that are in their 80s and they're still talking about their developmental trauma, which developmental trauma is huge. But from a Gabonese perspective, it's like all our mommy, daddy wounds and issues, we should be kind of moving out of those when we're in early adolescence. And the initiation is a sense of like, okay, you're leaving behind the trauma or the confusion or the childlike patterning and stepping into your sovereignty or your spiritual identity. And so in the West, there's a whole series of issues why we're sick spiritually and disconnected. If you think about it kind of simply, it's a pretty simple thing. It's like people suffer from addiction because they're emotionally disconnected, dealing usually with some kind of trauma. They don't have a sense of purpose or identity or what their gift is, why they're here, what they're here to do. And if you ever talk to someone, you've been in addiction, you're usually pretty disconnected from like, are you in your mission? Or are you in your purpose in life? Are you in your bliss? And also pretty disconnected from your body with what can happen with addiction. People are usually, trying to numb pain, numb trauma. And in Bwiti and with Iboga, it's the opposite. It's such that when you take Iboga, part of the initiation is taking a lot of medicine and then dancing. And if you've ever tried Iboga or heard of someone who's tried it, the last thing you think about is dancing. The medicine. It's a bit of a dissociative medicine that you feel pretty numb. You feel really heavy in your body. You're usually laid out for at least 12 hours. One caveat I could say is that with Ibogaine, the extract of Iboga, it's shorter. It's usually like a 8 to 10 hour trip with about a 12-hour recovery arc. And then with Iboga, with all the alkaloids, it can be 24, sometimes up to like 72 hours where you're still feeling the effects of it. There's a lot of nausea, purging, dizziness. You can get ringing in the ears. You're in a visionary state, and it's unique because people call Ibogaine, it's a dissociative, but it's also something that's called an oneophrenic psychedelic, which means it puts you in a dreamlike state. This oneophrenic word being from the Greek oneros. So it puts you in this dreamlike state for varying like 12, 18 hours, something like that. And then the whole next day, you're still altered. It's kind of like an introspective phase where you're not having visions, but you're definitely contemplative, not really feeling like talking, physically recovering, having different insights and seeing things from a different vantage point. It continues to be active because Ibogaine stores in your fat in your body. So it's one of the only psychedelics that stores up in the fat and it continues to be released, which translates to increased effects with mood and reduced cravings for substances and also kind of a longer efficacy arc of what it's doing. We mentioned the spiritual part, the trauma part of like, what are the origins of addiction? With Ibogaine and Iboga, there's clearly like a pharmacological thing that's happening where it's able to break people of cravings to opiates, alcohol, amphetamines. It doesn't work so well for benzos.
That's interesting.
Yeah. You mean the benzo part?
Yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't work. Benzos work on the GABA system.
I was thinking if it worked for alcohol, it would also work for benzos because they both work on GABA system, right?
Mm-hmm. This is true. Yeah, there's something, you can't detox somebody that's actively dependent on alcohol with Iboga because they're still going to go through alcohol withdrawals.
Right. That's true for sure.
So if someone is on benzos and they want to do Ibogaine, we usually just have them stay on their benzos because you don't want them going through like benzo withdrawal.
You said so much about the Ibogaine experience, the Iboga experience, which is so fascinating because it's so different than the way most people think about having a psychedelic experience in the Western world, right? The US population who's connected to psychedelics don't think about doing this in the Ibogaine tradition or Iboga tradition that you mentioned, the Bwiti tradition. And it's so interesting to think about all of the therapeutic benefits from Iboga that are possible, especially with really hard to treat disorders like opiate addiction, which we're in a crisis now, which I think why there's a lot more talk about Iboga and Ibogaine in the space in mental health in particular. And there are a bunch of really interesting studies going on around, I think in Canada and Europe, which I'm sure Joseph, you can enlighten us on. It's important to note that one of the things that I've always found interesting about Ibogaine or Iboga is that as powerful as it is as a healing agent, it's also one of the only psychedelic medicines that can kill you, right?
Yes, this is true. Yeah, it's got a pretty sensitive kind of safety window. I'm not a medical doctor, but it works on the HERG channel, which is like connected to cardiac functioning. And it can cause arrhythmias, bradycardia. It can slow your heart down. It's mainly the cardiac risk aspect with this medicine. So if you take a lot of Iboga or even low amounts of Iboga, sometimes people have these kind of subjective feelings of like their heart slowing up or speeding down, or you get more aware of your heart function. And it's a really essential point with this medicine that differentiates it from other psychedelics. This is not something that you want to do on your own for sure. It's definitely on par with ayahuasca in terms of its intensity, but even much more so. And as much as you would want like a guide or a shaman or someone that knows what they're doing with that medicine, even more so with Ibogaine in terms of the medical oversight. So if anyone's going to go and do this medicine, either for shamanic, psychospiritual, psychonaut purposes, or for like treatment of addiction or anything treatment wise, they have to get an EKG first because you have to rule out any kind of baseline anomalies in terms of cardiac function. So if someone's got like a heart murmur, or people even say like, oh, I'm a runner and I'm healthy, but then they go do like a thorough EKG and they might have some blips, some anomalies that could rule them out for Ibogaine treatment. So most clinics will not treat people that have a certain level of severity of a underlying cardiac issue. And then there's also other rule outs, like it can lower the seizure threshold for people who have a history of seizures, epilepsy. Ibogaine can make people manic. My colleague, my buddy Cole Marta published a case study on someone who showed up at the ER manic from Ibogaine.
We see that with a lot of psychedelics, that in particular.
Yeah, it happens with the tryptamines, with psilocybin, with ayahuasca. Iboga, I think it can even more so because it lasts so long. So if you take a deep dose of Iboga or Ibogaine, it converts through the liver into what's called noribogaine, which is the metabolite or the byproduct of Ibogaine being metabolized. And that stores in your fat in your liver and it's released for like weeks. So it's both helpful and it can be unhelpful in a clinical situation. Very helpful for addiction because someone does a treatment and they have this kind of long acting anti-addictive substance in their body that's helping them get through the withdrawal period and they're not craving. They go back home, hopefully with good support. They don't feel like they want to use. But if it throws somebody into psychosis or mania, it can last a while. I've seen people that have gone into psychosis from this. Usually it's just kind of time with the right context and care that someone will just realize, kind of like any psychedelic that you might spin out on like LSD or something. It just takes time and safety for it to kind of settle. That is a potential risk of that medicine. There's a number of risks. And one nice kind of guideline is this group called GITA, which is the Global Ibogaine Therapy Alliance. That was led for a number of years by a friend of mine, Jonathan Dickinson, and they developed kind of a consensus medical guidelines for using Ibogaine with exclusionary criteria and kind of best practices. There's a number of medications that are contraindicated that you can't take with Iboga. So it requires a lot of clinical finesse and screening. Definitely you need medical oversight when this is going on. So like the clinic Martine and I worked at that Martine was the director of, we brought people in that they already had been screened with their EKGs. We're doing full drug panels and metabolic panels when they get in, make sure their organs are functioning properly. A lot of people do have issues, especially in addiction. They're not always in the best health coming in. So it's really essential. There's a risk for people that are using amphetamines because amphetamines can tax the heart and create cardiac vulnerabilities. And then when you're in the session, ideally in a well-supervised medical clinic, you have active heart monitoring, active cardiac monitoring where a doctor can watch and see when you're on the medicine, track what's going on. So if for some reason your heart starts slowing down or there's some arrhythmias, they can use immediate kind of medical intervention. I'd say that the risk is much more intense with addiction treatment because people are coming in and you're using Ibogaine to like detox people off other substances. So there's more happening from a chemical standpoint. And also people tend to be more medically fragile that are coming in with severe or chronic addiction. So in the shamanic or neo-shamanic, my partner Trish and I, we lead international retreats in countries where it's open. Like what we do is we screen people with an EKG, and then we always have a doctor on site present during the ceremonies to keep eyes on people and kind of do like 5-minute checks and just make sure everyone's breathing, they're doing good, they're, have kind of a hawk eye on everyone. It's also dose dependent, like most things, like the safety risk increases with higher dosages. So a lot of the protocols that are being developed or have been developed for addiction, multiple low dose Ibogaine experiences, like over a course of days or sometimes weeks, so that you're reducing the risk with a heavy dosing and you're giving someone the medicine so they can get the reset, heal their addiction, but not have the cardiac risk. And there's an incredible pioneer woman who developed a protocol like this named Claire Wilkins. She ran a clinic I think she still does in Mexico. And she published a paper on this where she was using kind of like lower, not even necessarily psychedelic dosage of Ibogaine over a course of weeks and able to bring people off of methadone. That's something that if people don't know about methadone, if you have a heroin addiction or an opiate addiction in the US and you want to get treatment, usually you're prescribed these kind of long-acting replacement opiates to ideally be more safe than shooting heroin or having a lower risk for overdose. And you can be on them for months or years sometimes, but they're nasty to get off of.
Yeah, methadone for a lot of people is harder to get off of than what they were trying to get off of before.
Totally. Yeah, I worked in a methadone clinic in the VA in West LA, and it was like, I don't know that I've been more personally depressed in a work environment ever than seeing these Vietnam vets that were addicted to heroin in Vietnam, and they come and get their daily dose at the window at the VA of their methadone, and they're just still kind of juiced up on that. And it's really hard to get off of. So one thing that's good to know, if people have friends that are on these things and want to go to Ibogaine, it's actually kind of a bad setup to try to go from methadone or Suboxone, this other replacement opiate, to Ibogaine, because they're designed to last longer. They have longer half-lives, or they stay on the body longer. And Ibogaine really only works with short-acting opiates like Percocet, Oxycontin, heroin, Vicodin, these kind of things that don't last as long in the system. So what can happen, like you have a friend or someone who's referred to Ibogaine that's on Suboxone, and people do it on the internet all the time. It's or
fentanyl.
Fentanyl, yeah, completely. If people hear, oh, Ibogaine's this amazing psychedelic cure for opiate addiction, but they're on one of those medicines and they do Ibogaine, they basically come out feeling somewhat better 48 hours, and then 72 hours or later, they go back into active withdrawal, and it's like a nightmare. So it's like what has to happen with the protocol of that is they basically have to transition to short-acting opiates. So if you're on Suboxone or methadone, they have to find a way to go back on a shorter acting opiate like Oxycontin or Vicodin or something like that, and then do Ibogaine, which is a whole nother kind of conundrum because most doctors won't prescribe short acting opiates because of the addiction liability.
You're listening to the Psychedelic Report.
It's a deeply spiritual and relational issue that we're dealing with addiction. And so 5-MeO, it's really interesting, these two medicines, because in some ways they're actually like a puzzle piece with how they work in the brain. So Ibogaine has a really complex pharmacology. And if anyone's into pharmacology, this could be like a hole to go down with how it works. And even the pharmacists that work on Ibogaine are still scratching their heads as to how it works. But it works on so many different receptors in the brain, but it doesn't work on kind of the signature pathways that 5-MeO-DMT works on. So Ibogaine works on opiate system, the NMDA receptors, which ketamine works on the sigma receptors that are associated with pain signaling, as well as the opiate receptors associated with pain. The nicotine system, it does not work so much on serotonin. Iboga does boost the serotonin transporter, so it lets serotonin hang out longer in your brain, but it's not like a classic hallucinogen like LSD or psilocybin or even ayahuasca that work on this kind of mystical pathway, these like 2A serotonin 2 kind of receptor pathways. So if you take Iboga, it's kind of in some ways the opposite of mushrooms, ayahuasca, DMT. Like it's not euphoric. You don't really have a mystical experience. When you take Iboga, you usually know where you are. You can kind of open your eyes and you don't usually feel a sense of like merging with the environment around you. And 5-MeO is kind of like a peak psychedelic in the sense of like, it sort of takes you to the peak experiential aspect of like a high dose kind of LSD or psilocybin experience. And it takes you right there with somewhat of a different flavor or different entry, but it takes you there rapidly, like right away. It's very short acting and it has a very rapid effect. So what's interesting about that experience is really like a lot of what you shared. It does get you into those experiences that people talk about on psychedelics where you just feel one with all that is, where you lose your subjective sense of where you end and where everything else begins. It can be profoundly blissful and very sacred. One of the posters that we did off some of this Crossroads data was, there's an older scale called the States of Consciousness questionnaire. It's like 100 items. And we looked at all the items of what people said when they used 5-MeO-DMT. And one of the peak things people said is that it was profoundly sacred and holy. This experience is beyond language. And so what's nice about it in a way, doing it on the back end of an Ibogaine experience is Iboga is very challenging and if not like harrowing on the intensity and on the body. You can feel like you got hit by a bus, like physically, which is kind of interesting because then you rest for 2 nights and you feel sometimes the best you've ever felt. It's like a deep cleanse. It's a reset of the brain and people often feel profoundly peaceful and grounded. But when people are going into an Ibogaine experience with addiction, when you're deep in addiction, you're running from a lot. You're running from yourself, or you're running from your pain. If you're really deep in addiction, you might have had experiences with people that you regret, not been at your highest in terms of your character. And so Iboga can be profoundly confronting. People talk about it like a stern teacher. And so to do 5-MeO on the back end of that experience can feel kind of like being bathed in a bit of grace or love that can kind of complete the cleansing and the detox process of the Ibogaine. So what's been amazing to witness with addiction and just people in general receiving 5-MeO-DMT is that they get a profound sense of like a spiritual interconnection, perhaps being able to situate themselves, that they're not alone, that there is some bigger intelligence that's working. I have a spiritual background. I like to say like we're swimming in God all the time. Like we're always swimming in magic and spirit. And when people use 5-MeO-DMT, sometimes they can connect to that. That being said, sometimes 5-MeO-DMT can be profoundly terrifying and scary and too much. And it's something that requires really delicate dosing and real sensitivity in the administration because it is very, very strong by weights. Very small dosages can put you into a peak psychedelic experience, the most intense you've ever had, and take you there like with no warning in a matter of seconds. And what 5-MeO does kind of before that mystical experience or on the way there is it can be also a purgative. It can energetically draw out stuck traumas in the body, blocked emotions. So at the lower doses, 5-MeO is a really profound kind of way to liberate emotions or have a kind of emotional catharsis that can be really healing for addiction. We have a lot of people that they'll do 5-MeO-DMT and they're kind of just crying deep belly cries of releasing sadness and also kind of primal energy that's been trapped in the body. So I think for me as a psychotherapist, it's really fascinating what 5-MeO does from a trauma healing perspective. I've seen it go deeper than some of the other psychedelics like MDMA or psilocybin in terms of the depth that it can get at. But with this medicine also, you cannot put up enough disclaimers with how delicate it needs to be administered and how strong it is. And
Probably not a recommended first choice, right? If for someone who's new.
no way. Yeah. It's like they're both kind of the deep end in terms of psychedelic intensity. And if I had a nickel for every time a therapist uses the onion metaphor, but I think the onion metaphor is like really good. Like when people have layers of trauma or things that need healing, it's like you don't want to rip the onion open. You want to like go gently and stepwise and in stages. And I've seen people that have a lot of repressed trauma or emotions in their body seek out 5-MeO for whatever reason, and they just get flooded with all of this repressed stuff. And what's hard about 5-MeO is you go online to like understand or metabolize what's happening. So if you do something like MDMA, for example, which is like a way better starting place for healing, you can kind of language and identify like, oh, these feelings are coming up and it's connected with this, or you can give yourself permission to feel or be seen with a therapist and like process it. Whereas if someone's got a lot under the hood in terms of like their body and trauma and emotions, it's kind of like you have no frontal lobes on 5-MeO DMT and it's just coming up and kind of can oversaturate you and overwhelm you. And you don't really have a way to process it that fast. In our research, like 30% of people said in their 5-MeO experience at some point, they felt like they were dying, disintegrating, or falling apart. And some people described it as feeling like they were in some kind of hellish experience.
We're all, should question whether we're ready for those kinds of experiences. But I think a lot of it is, as Joseph was saying, you really have to just prepare yourself and all the preparatory work and the intention shaping work and really being intentional about our experience and curating the set and setting so carefully with who and where we are is really fundamental to preparing us to lean in and accept whatever we're going to experience for what it is, without judgment and without fear or reservation, because that's why we're here.
In transitioning, I want to teach you a Bwiti word to acknowledge what you just said. In Bwiti, we say base, which means like truth, like affirming the truth of what you just said. So I want to say base. Yes, yes. Yeah, I would say I found it helpful to think about it like developmentally. You don't jump into a rocket ship if you want to be an astronaut first. You go in float pools and anti-gravity chambers. And it's really meaningful and helpful preparation to kind of do that work in a stepwise progression and do MDMA in a guided context. I don't know, half a dozen times. Do work with psilocybin, work with ketamine, these things that are like more widely available, that are accessible, that have more support, I think, right now, and learn how to let go and learn how to connect to what you're holding and learn what's in your own mind and in your body. And I would say that's, I think, a much more kind of wise approach to take. And then it depends on what someone's going through, but sometimes people need, quote unquote, like the big guns or maybe one of these two medicines. Like if I had a family member that was knee deep in addiction, they might not have time to go do a bunch of other psychedelic work or access to it. And Iboga is like the mother lode in terms of being able to heal addiction rapidly. And there's nothing like it for that. So in that context, I think it might be the best kind of frontline treatment for someone who's in addiction. 5-MeO DMT, it's kind of a wild west because there's a lot of use happening all over the place and a lot of underground and international and shamanic facilitators. Most people that use it are attempting to get people to that kind of full release dose or that full kind of ego loss depth. And at that depth, that's where if people haven't done a lot of breath work or somatic release or other somatic therapy or other psychedelic work, it can have a high probability of not going well or having a challenging integration. And I also say some people have done 5-MeO as their first psychedelic and had an amazing experience.
You're listening to the Psychedelic Report.
I came to Iboga to heal myself from Lyme disease, actually, initially. And Iboga is interesting, definitely like performance enhancement. I can say publicly because he said publicly, like Ben Greenfield, you guys know him, he's talked about Iboga microdosing for performance applications. And funny enough, the way Iboga was discovered by the French, they said there's a strange substance that the pygmies use and they can walk all day and walk for miles or whatever and not get tired, not get fatigued. And Iboga has this real kind of adaptogenic quality where if you take it, you can stay up for a lot longer than normal. It's kind of like this balanced, adaptive, long-acting stimulant that when you're in Gabon, or even a lot of practitioners that use Iboga, you can take Iboga and you can stay up for days and not feel tired. And then when you do sleep, it kind of consolidates your sleep in a way that 4 hours feels like 8 hours. So there's definitely, like, on the physical performance enhancement aspect, it does give you physical superpowers. I would say both 5-MeO and Iboga have profound neuroregenerative potential. Iboga has already been patented for treating Parkinson's and Alzheimer's disease. There's a lot of clinics that were treating people that had Parkinson's with low-dose Ibogaine that was reversing their Parkinsonian symptoms. The magic aspects of Ibogaine is it stimulates these neurotropic factors in the brain, which the abbreviation would be GDNF, glial-derived neurotropic factors, which is kind of unique amongst psychedelics. A lot of psychedelics stimulate BDNF, brain-derived neurotropic factors, which is another miracle grow substance for growing new neurons. But Iboga specifically helps regenerate dopamine neurons, which is why it's helpful for Parkinson's disease. It's helpful for cognitive functioning, for focus. And what happened with our clinic with Martin is he kind of pivoted into treating veterans a couple of years ago. We had to actually close the standing clinic that we were using due to some, like, kind of political scene in Tijuana and Baja where we were at. But he kind of pivoted into working exclusively with veterans. And most of these veterans were coming because they had traumatic brain injury, and kind of the signature wounding of a lot of the veterans that have served recently or had multiple deployments is this kind of combination of brain injury and PTSD. And a lot of them had underlying, oftentimes undiagnosed brain injuries that were comorbid with the PTSD. And then they were drinking or using substances to kind of numb out and didn't really know that they had a neurologic injury. And so a lot of these vets would come through and do Ibogaine and literally say they felt like they got a brain transplant. And I personally experienced that from having Lyme disease, which is kind of like syphilis in terms of how it gets in the brain. And the first time I did an Iboga treatment in Costa Rica, I was crying because I felt like someone had gone in and, like, rebooted my brain and, reversed 10 years of illness and give me a super brain.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a profound neuroregenerative substance. It's funny, when you do Iboga in Bwiti, they call you a baby. They call you, the word is banzi. They call you coming into it, the ceremony, they call you a banzi, which means like you're being reborn. And when you come out of an Iboga journey, a lot of times people feel like that way. Like you kind of have this almost like Buddha blank, no thoughts, everything's quiet, everything is fresh, there's no chatter. It's a really tender template and tender time after that experience to kind of be reintroduced to your life and go gently. And Iboga slows everything down mentally so that you can kind of have a fresh start.
It's so interesting. And so much hope for healing from these medicines, and just hearing you talk about how they're currently used and also the traditions of how they've been used. It's just so incredible, and there's so much to hope for. And with all of the incredible benefits that Iboga can offer us, it can kill you. So be extra careful and be safe, and make sure that if you do seek out these kinds of medicines, 5-MeO can also give unpleasant experiences that are very intense. So please make sure that you find someone who is qualified and trained to help you. Thank you so much, Joseph.
Yeah, really excited to be here. Thank you for listening. And if you want to connect with me, I have a website with a contact form. That's Joseph Barsuglia, which is BARSUGLIA.com. And happy to follow up on the conversation, make new friends. And this is my love and mission and purpose. So happy to connect with anyone that we didn't have a chance to talk with.
Thanks for listening to The Psychedelic Report. Visit us at thepsychedelicreport.com. This show is recorded weekly on Clubhouse with a live audience. The Psychedelic Report was brought to you by Apollo Neuroscience and produced by Future Medicine Media. While I am a doctor, I'm not your doctor. So please don't take anything you hear on the Psychedelic Report as personal medical advice, because we don't know you. If you have questions about anything you hear on this show, please consult with your doctor.